All right, welcome back, friends. So in this video, we're going to continue to talk about arrays. So up until this point, we've seen how we can create an array. An array is just a list of data, and we can store whatever we want in it. So we can store numbers and strings and Boolean values. We can also store other arrays. So the idea is that we have stored things in arrays, and we've taken things out, we've accessed information, evaluated it. For instance, if we want to reach the first item of an array, right? We also talked about array methods such as push and pop and shift and unshift. But what I started to say earlier, up until this point, we haven't seen how we could access every piece of an array or do something to every item in an array. And that's what an array iteration refers to, right? So it's iterating over a list, iterating over an array. Basically looping through that array and doing something to each item or with each item. So I'll give you a couple of real-world examples and their applications of array iteration. So a common example, if you can think about it, is comments and posts. We see them all the time. In particular, we'll think about comments on Facebook, okay? So in the background, these comments are stored in an array. And in order to display all of those comments, what actually happens is that some code loops through that array. It iterates over that array, and for each one, it creates an HTML when we iterate over an array. So, array iteration obviously is important. And usually when you want to work with an array, we have a list of data that we want to do something to. Let's say just every item in that list. Keep in mind that Facebook comments and posts example. Otherwise, if you only want to work with just the first item or always the seventh item, then maybe you shouldn't be using an array. Maybe you should just store that item in a variable. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to develop and then see in this video. First thing we're going to learn is how to use a for loop to iterate over an array. Then we're going to learn a new iteration method, which is for each. Okay, so we've seen for loops in action and we've seen while loops before. So in this video, we're going to see the for each, and I find it very helpful, so will you. After that, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of the for each. So why don't I give you a concrete example? So first I'm going to copy this books array and paste it here. So we're going to work with this array. So we have an array of books that has 4 items, 4 strings: Harry Potter, Hobbit, Hunger Games, Little Prince. And now I want to print out every item of this array. So to do that, we're going to use a loop to help automate this process. Okay, now let's write our for loop. So I'll say for, and inside of it, I'll say var I equals 0. Now we're going to write our condition. So up until this point, we've written something like I is less than 20, or I is bigger than or equal to 10. But now I want to reach every item of the array. So I'm going to work with the array's length. So say I is less than books.length. And then each time we're just going to be adding 1. So in our for loop, var I starts at 0, because that's always the first index in the array. And then we add 1 each time through the loop, and we keep going. Var I is less than the length of the books array. So you got to remember the length of this array is 4. So var I is less than 4. That should never equal 4 because books 4 isn't defined. So this type of for loop is really common. All right, so now I'll open my curly braces, and inside of it I'll say console.log. Now here, I want to write every item of our array. So how do you do that? How do you reach items of an array, basically? We use square brackets, and inside of it, we write the index of the item in the array, as hopefully you know. And to reach every index of the array, I'll say books, square brackets, and I. All right, so you get it. This is very common usage. So let's save all this and go to our console. So here, when we refresh the page in the console, we see our 4 books. All right, so going back to our example, this is what we'd actually do with something like comments. You would do for var I equal to 0, and then I is less, and comments.length. Rather than console.logging something, we might have a function called createCommentHTML or something like that. And that would be responsible for making all HTML for one comment. All right. And now we're going to do it to every item in the comments array. So that translates. Okay, so that's how we can use a for loop. So now I'm going to comment out these lines, and I'm going to do the same operation with the for each method this time. And I think the for each method is much easier, and it's certainly a shorter method. And as I said before, this is an array method. It's something new. It's a little intimidating, where we're actually passing a function into another function. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about it. So it's a method that's called for each, and that's defined on every single array. So it's part of something called the array prototype, which is where all of those methods like push and pop and shift and unshift, that's where they all live. And before that, remember how we reached these array methods, right? For instance, here we reach the slice method by saying friends.slice. So array name.slice, and we're going to reach to the for each method the same way, just by saying array.forEach. So down in here, I can say books.forEach and then my parentheses. Now we're going to read the statement like that. For each item in the books array, we're going to call a function. We are going to, we're going to make something. For now, I'll say some func, and now we're going to create a function here. And actually, what this does is it takes a function as an argument. Perhaps you're a step ahead of me. Generally, we can create an anonymous function, and to do that, I'll just say function in parentheses and then curly braces. But at the moment, I want this function just to console log my books. Okay? So what have I done here? I've called this function for every single element in the books array. And the only thing this function does is console logging the myBooks string. Okay, so let's save all this and go to the console. Now here I'll refresh the page, and here we can see that myBooks is written 4 times here. Now let's return to the code. So here what we've done is we write myBooks to the console 4 times because we have 4 elements in our array, and for every single element in the array, we console log myBooks. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But I want to reach every element inside this function. And before you jump to any conclusions, I know it might be the only exercise you get, but it's very simple. This anonymous function's first argument is every item of the books array. And this argument can be called, well, anything that we want, just like any other function that we can define. So for now, every item of this array is actually a book name. So I'll say book, just to make sense. And here, instead of console log my books, I want to console log this book. So this book is every single element of this book's array. Right? Okay. Now, as I said before, we can call this argument whatever we want. I'll save this, go to my console. So here when I refresh the page, we'll see all the book names in the console, just like we saw with for loop. All right, so let's return to the code. Now here, as I said, we can call this argument however we want. So I can change these to ASD. So this time I'll say ASD in every item of the array. I'll save all this, go to the console. So here when I refresh the page, as you see, nothing's changed. Okay, so let's return to our code again. And here I'm going to change these to be book again, just so that it can remain clear, memorable, and sensical. All right, so my dear friends, you now know the for each method. Now, as you see, it's shorter than the for loop. So if we compare for and for each in the for loop, we need to create a different variable, just like this I variable. But with the for each method, we don't have to do something like that because the for each method is a built-in array method. All right, cool. So in this video, we certainly talked about array iteration, and you'll see how it works very successfully to our advantage. All right, so we'll pause quickly right here and continue in the next video.